Welcome, students, to MB775, the last quarter of your second year. You are at what we might call a mountaintop moment. That's a phrase that I use when I'm preparing a couple for their wedding. That I say that a wedding is a mountaintop moment. It's a moment where you can look back over where your relationship started, how it got to this point, and when you can look forward into the future about what you dream and hope for your marriage. It's a moment where there can be great clarity. You are at a mountaintop moment in this process. You are almost halfway through. This quarter, you are primarily focused on your initial analysis of your data and on writing up your data. Of course, some of you are still collecting data, and we recognize that. And even for those of you who have finished the bulk of your data collection, by the end of this quarter, you will have identified gaps. You may have identified additional data that you need to collect. You may have identified additional books that you need to include in your literature review, additional materials. So you may not, you're not completely done with those earlier phases of data collection and lit review. But you've got the first major chunk under your belt, and this is a time to look backwards and look forwards. We recognize, of course, that for those of you who've been collecting data, you may feel a little at this moment like you're drowning, that you are drowning in a flood of data. And the question for you, and it is for many people an anxious question, if not a desperate question, is what do I do with all this data? How do I make sure that I do this right? So this particular week, what we're doing is we want to help to ground you and center you. We want to help you to re-find your focus so that you are as equipped as possible to deal with the flood of data. So we are going to ask you to ask yourself a few questions. We want you to go back, and we want you to remember why you believe that God called you into this work in the first place. Why did you end up in a doctoral program? Often when I'm talking to people about the potential for going into a doctoral program, I say, what is the burning question that keeps you up at night? As you do your mission, as you carry out your mission, as you carry out your ministry, what troubles you? What do you wish you knew more about? And that's usually what actually leads us into a doctorate. So I want you to go back, and I want you to think about that. And you are going to be sharing about that this week with each other in our synchronized session. Then I want you to think about what you've already learned. And I want you to think about it in a way where you don't worry about whether you're doing it right. You don't worry right now about whether it's verifiable or verified. You don't worry about whether you've got a perfect analysis. I want you to ask this question of yourself intuitively. If you were to walk away right now, what are the 1, 2, 3 things or 1 to 5 things that you would have learned about your burning question? And one of the ways that I often think about this is you want to get to the heart of the data. You want to get to the simple insights that it will be at the heart of your data. But you don't want to forget the limbs, that there will be a number of areas where you know that you've learned something important, but it's a little peripheral. You're not quite sure about it. You're not sure how it fits in. So there's these limbs hanging out that you want to make sure to, put on different shelves in your mind, maybe in your notebook. But there's also insights that you have that are the heart, that you say, yes, this helps me with the burning question. So we want you to just name casually and informally for yourself what those are. What's the heart of what you've learned? What are some of the limbs, the extra insights that you're not as sure about, but you know they're sort of important? Then a really important question, if God has called you into this, He has called you into this for your equipping. So how have you been changed by the process? How have you grown? Not groaned. They go together sometimes. How have you grown? What skills have you learned? What spiritual maturity perhaps have you gained? And then, this is very preliminary, but just as of now, what do you think some of the gaps are? What have you learned that you need to test? That you think it's important, you think you've learned it, but you're not sure. What more do you need to know? There may be some additional theory that you need, additional insight from the materials, from all of those who have studied this before and are continuing to study it. And what more do you need to ask? What more data perhaps do you need to collect, and who do you need to collect it from? So we want you to ask these questions, to share the answers to these questions. I think that the questions that you have in your assignment are not exactly like these. I didn't go back and check them, but they're more or less in the ballpark. So the ones you have in your assignment are the ones that you actually need to answer on paper and to be ready to share. But I wanted to speak more freely and more informally about just this process of finding your focus and how important it is for you to work on that this week. Now, when you go into analysis, we are giving you a number of tools, and it is easy to be not only overwhelmed by the flood of data, but overwhelmed by all the possible tools. So I want to underline that our purpose in giving you all of these tools is not so that you would use them all, nor so that you would pick the right tool, because that is a process, figuring out exactly what the right tool is. What we actually want you to do in your first stage of data analysis is to be free to experiment. Use different tools. I want to give you an example, a parallel, with biblical criticism, which I'm pretty sure that all of you have run into at some point in your theological education. I remember the first time I ran into it was as an undergraduate, because one of my majors was religion, and I had to take a course on biblical criticism, and I thought at the beginning that it was stupid. Let me just tell you, I was like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing form criticism and source criticism? And, I didn't think there was any truth in it until I got to social criticism, where we began to look at the historical context in more depth and the cultural context. And then I went, oh, that lens is really helpful. And then I realized that all the lenses were actually helpful, that there's a prism in Scripture, right? And that if you look at it from many different angles, I had been trained at that point in the InterVarsity inductive Bible study model, and that was very useful, and that was the one that I liked. But you can look at it from many different directions, and the more directions you look at it from, the more you begin to learn about the phenomena that you're studying. So that's what I'm encouraging you to do. That's what we are encouraging you to do, is to play a little. Not to use every tool we're giving you, but to use a number of them. Just play with them. See what you learn. Now, of course, to use any of the tools, you have to start by being able to describe clearly, to sum up your data. And that's a skill in itself. So you're just describing what you've learned, what you've seen, and then you need to begin to analyze it. So the video that we gave you this week goes pretty deeply into literary analysis, into the analysis of a narrative. And those of you particularly who are doing phenomenology, but even those of you who are doing other kinds of qualitative research, still might find it very useful to think about the narratives that people are giving you and how you might approach them using the tools of literary analysis. The video also mentions the Likert scale, which is an interesting option. And of course, we've already talked to you about word studies. We've already talked to you about thematic studies. Those are all tools that you can experiment with. But as you experiment, what's going to happen, of course, is you begin to categorize. The end of all analysis is the identification of useful categories and the connections between them. Now, don't be afraid of the fact that some of those categories are overlapping. You could fit the data here, or you could fit it there just as easily. One of the new aspects of decolonized research is the understanding that you can put data in more than one category. That used to be considered inappropriate. Now, several different scholars working in the decolonized field are using this kind of petal image, like the petals of a flower that overlap. So, don't get freaked out because the data could fit more than one place. Put it more than one place. See what you learn from that. Also, be sure to articulate your own observations. What's the tone that you heard in the voice of the person? What's the spirit of the interview? How do you think they were feeling? How were you feeling on the other end of them? What were your reactions? All of that can give you data. So play and pray, because God will guide you through this process. He has brought you this far, and He is going to bring you to the end. So pray your way through it, which will also calm your anxiety. So I hope that's useful for your first week. We would say in Spanish, adelante, and we will look forward to talking to you this week as well.